So good afternoon to everybody. And welcome to the second policy series session that we are organizing here at the Brussels School of Governance. And more particularly, these events are funded by Ecovalence Project and Sustain Jean Monnet project that we are developing here at the Brussels School of Governance. The second session of this policy series is about sustainable trade and the environment. And more particularly, we want to analyze the coherence and complexities of EU trade agreements with particular emphasis on Latin America. I mean, we have just 1 hour and a half, so I will just briefly introduce the members of the panel. I will just refer to some specific guiding questions that we sent to you, and then I will just open the floor for your interventions. The idea is that each of you, and also Andrea, who is online, will have more or less 7 minutes to just present your reflections about the topic, and then I will just give you again the floor just to react to the comments and statements of the members of the panel, and then finally we will open the floor for questions. Some of the guiding questions that we sent to the members of the panel connect with this interaction between trade and the environment, also in the framework of the relations between EU and Latin American countries. So I would just mention them is what synergies have been achieved between the trade and environmental policies in the EU and Latin America. What obstacles or trade-offs hinder the further integration of trade and environmental objectives in trade agreements of the EU and Latin American countries? What interactions emerge between the EU recent trade measures and bilateral trade negotiations? And how do the approaches of the European Union and Latin American countries to sustainable trade differ or resemble each other? Members of the panel of today. So first we have Dora Correa, Director of the Directorate General Trade of the European Commission. Johan Mulder, Chief Sustainable Trade Unit from United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, and visiting fellow from UNUCRIS. Elias Luna Santos, Minister Conseiller for Economic and Trade Affairs from the Brazilian Embassy, Brazilian Mission to the European Union, here in Brussels. Mathilde Dupré, co-directrice the Beblan Institute. So you are, in a way, the representative of the civil society organizations here. And Andrea Ribeiro Hoffman, Associate Professor of Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. So I will give the floor first to Dora Correa, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Liliana, and very warm greetings to all participants, including the online ones. I will start by giving you a very, let's say, broad brush of what we are doing in the Commission relative to this nexus between trade and environment, focusing in particular in the last 5 years in the current mandate. I will maybe conclude by some forward-looking elements, but I think those can be also kept for the discussion. So no need to highlight that, of course, fighting climate change, decarbonizing our economy is the existential issue of our societies. And this Commission has put it at the core of its priorities for the mandate. And in that has also been very clear on the need to mobilize all EU policies, including trade, to support that objective. And this has been a very sort of tectonic shift for trade policy in the last few years, as we move to really, as a policy, supports the shift to a carbon neutral economy. So how have we been doing that? We've been acting at different levels, multilateral level, bilateral level through our agreements, but also through our, let's say, own domestic internal policies. So let me quickly go through these different levels. Of multilateral levels, of course, I mean basically the WTO, where we have been pushing very strongly for a trade and environment agenda. And there is indeed lots of interest and activity in spite of not having the necessary consensus at the last ministerial to actually have specific commitments on trade and environment. So in the absence of that consensus, we've been working very hard in different plurilaterals, covering fossil fuels, covering environmental sustainability, covering plastics, to push for a more prominent trade, a role for trade in achieving a climate neutral and circular economy. Now, it hasn't been easy, but the fact that these plurilaterals exist as a framework for dialogue is extremely important, again, in particular, in the absence of a multilateral consensus. And I also think it's very positive that we had, for example, for the first time, a trade day in the last COP28, where WTO was very much present and visible. Coming back to the EU, we have also launched with a number of co-sponsors, Ecuador, Kenya, and New Zealand, a coalition of trade ministers for climate, where we have in the margins actually of MC13, where we have agreed on a list of or a menu of voluntary actions that the ministers have committed to actually take individually in their own countries and collectively to enhance the contribution of trade to fighting climate change. So that is, you know, following a series of meetings where I would say the added value was to bring the debate between the nexus, the debate on the nexus between climate and trade to the political level. We now have this concrete deliverable of a menu of voluntary actions. So a multilateral level, this is what we have been pushing. Bilaterally, and I think Liliana mentioned this, of course, as well, we have upgraded our approach to sustainability in our bilateral trade agreements. We've reviewed our TSD, Trade and Sustainable Development, our TSD policy in 2022, coming to very ambitious trade and sustainability chapters in our free trade agreements. Not only with a large menu of different commitments in many areas, but also with a degree of legally binding commitments covered by dispute settlement. And I think the recently concluded agreement with New Zealand is really the new gold standard in terms of how sustainability can be weaved into our agreements. This being said, and I think this is an important point, it's not only the letter of the agreement, it's then how we put it in practice. And the fact that we have trade and sustainable development committees for these FTAs gives us a platform for dialogue, for engagement with our partners, but also with civil society in our partners to discuss these matters. And this is a very valuable tool. Now, of course, and I'm now moving to the third level, which is this internal domestic autonomous instruments that we have as well. The fact that we have these trade and sustainable development committees, for example, with our FTA partners, have allowed us to have a forum, a platform, where we discuss our legislation, we inform our partners about what measures we want to take, and how we see, you know, the different needs in terms of complying with these measures, but also it's also a platform for dialogue. So then our partners can share with us their concerns on these measures and their views on the different consultative moments. And of course, now I come to the domestic legislation, and this is the very visible part, and then I conclude. Which of course covers the so-called autonomous instruments like the deforestation regulation, like CBAM, and etc. And of course, we very much recognize that these measures will impact production, consumption, investment, and also our relations with third countries, and affect, you know, substantially economic activity and EU trade. But given the urgency to transition to this decarbonized economy, I don't think the question is whether we should be putting these measures in place, is actually how we put the measures in place. And this is why we have very much been associated as DigiTrade in the policy design phase to ensure that the measures are WTO compliant, non-discriminatory. And then once the measures are adopted, we have been, again, very active in putting in place what we call an external outreach strategy, which is based on 3 pillars. And this is my last point. First of all, we've been very keen and very transparent on engagement. We've engaged with our partners bilaterally. We've engaged in WTO. We have multi-stakeholder platforms like the EU Deforestation Platform to consult the different stakeholders touched by these measures, to be able to not only explain and hopefully raise the awareness about the measures, but also to factor in the input we get. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is to develop trade facilitation and tools that help our partners implement the different autonomous instruments. And this can be the frequently asked questions, it can be different databases, repositories of good practices, so that, you know, the implementation and compliance is facilitated as much as possible. And the third element is to mobilize all the capacity building, development, cooperation tools that we have to try to, in particular, for developing and least developed countries, to try to support them in the implementation of these measures. So this is what I wanted to say, looking backwards, and I will keep the forward-looking elements for the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Dora. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, thank you much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here, and I will very much connect to Dora's introduction. And basically, I would like to discuss in my 7 minutes 3 points. First, what have been synergies between trade agreements and environmental policies, and I will mainly talk about how environmental dimensions have been incorporated into trade agreements in the regions. Second, what are sort of the obstacles of integrating an environmental objective into trade agreement in the regions? And third, how the recently adopted unilateral measures by the EU are being perceived and how they may trigger or not regional cooperation within Latin America and the Caribbean. So just, I think it's very frank to say that the incorporation of environmental dimensions and measures into trade agreements was really a process driven by trading partners outside Latin America and the Caribbean, and specifically the United States in the European Union, where the distinctive features by the EU was that the chapters and regulations were very much based on multilateral, of respecting multilateral environmental agreements, look into issues like also of complying with national laws, and very much the emphasis on collaboration. Whereas on the other hand, the US approach, which is I think quite well highlighted in the USMCA, the latest agreement is much more on enforcement and has actually a dispute settlement mechanism integrated to the extent that one of the partners does not comply with its commitments and can be fined, or there's even the option of trade sanctions. Now, following the US and the European approach, I mean, Latin American countries have become very active in incorporating environmental aspects in their own trade agreements. So it has become from north-south very much also a south-south process. And really the leaders in that context have been Peru and Colombia, that have, for example, introduced biodiversity provisions, making sure that the access and use of genetic resources is shared between all members of the agreement. And I would also like to highlight the role of Costa Rica, who is really one of the key members of pushing the multilateral agenda within the trade and environmental sustainability structure discussion, TESDI, and is seen also at the latest ministerials. Now, a few words on what are the obstacles of, what are really the factors that are limiting or hindering the inclusion of environmental objectives into trade agreements. Well, it's quite a long list, but just to mention a few aspects. One is that all these environmental provisions are sort of intentions. They are not legally binding or enforceable. So they focus on cooperation, information exchange, upholding environmental laws, but in very few cases they are really binding commitments. Second, there are some sectors and also elites in Latin America that are very much against introducing environmental aspects in the trade agreements, because they feel that they will be affected a lot by these measures. So so the so-called green protection. Then there's of course also the issue of cost. So to the extent that in particular for small producers, they have to comply with environmental standards. This has a huge impact, and currently prices that are paid for commodities cultivated in Latin America, coffee, cacao, and other products, in particular by these very small producers, they are already on close to poverty. So it's very difficult for them to cover costs, and each time we shove more standards and regulations down their throats, excuse me for the expression, and it's impossible for them to comply with these standards. And even like the fair trade movement with whom I've been working, that they pay a small top up. It's really, we need a totally different business model where these producers get paid a much higher price, a completely different distribution of all the value that's being generated in the value chain, and only by shifting much more resources to upstream. There might be a probability that with all the cooperation they would also get, they could comply with these regulations. Then I think a major issue in Latin America is that we have very little regional cooperation and harmonization in the region. So we have a patchwork of bilateral agreements, and each agreement is different, and there are very few harmonization across these agreements. And maybe the agreements the EU has with the different trading partners in Latin America can be embased to sort of harmonize and foster cooperation among Latin American partners to make sure that in the future we can comply with these agreements. And just a final word on what are sort of the interaction and the reactions to the last point by Dora, saying these unilateral measures. Well, from the region, and I'm sure that Elias will comment more on that as well, we see with a lot of concern all these measures coming through, and despite the fact that they may be WTO compliant in terms of non-discriminatory, there's an element of capacity building and also trade facilitation. The large majority, in particular of small producers, are unprepared. And so I think there's a real question of, how sustainable is this in the end, really? A consequence of these trade measures might be that in the end, many of the small producers in particular will be shut out of the European market. And so there's really a need to really increase, I think, the transition period and look in really ways that these measures can be implemented, in particular at the base of many value chains related to products that are being imported by the EU from the region. And finally, I would like to mention the point of the importance of the trade agreements. I think those are really you have regular meetings with your trading partners in Latin America, and I think that is really the channel to introduce those measures. And so I think it's really unfortunate that we agree with the urgency, but at the same time these measures are so challenging to be introduced in Latin America. So hopefully the trade agreements and the renewal of the trade agreements you already have done with Chile, and now you're in the final stage with Mexico, and now with the Andean countries, are really opportunities to beef up cooperation and technical assistance, and also find ways, of of helping the countries, and in particular the small producers, to comply with these measures, and to really make sure that we don't only comply with environmental standards, European mental, but also make sure that we keep supporting the base of the pyramid of the producers to make it truly inclusive.
Thank you very much. Then Elias, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity to share our thoughts from a Brazilian perspective on these issues of very important issues for Brazil related to trade and sustainable development. I was listening to the previous presentations, and I was tempted to already start reacting to some of the points, but I may do that to a certain extent, but leave some for later as well, for the interaction later. I listened to Dora's presentation, and I chose a structure which is very similar to hers. I'm starting with maybe what Brazil has been doing internally to promote sustainable development objectives, and then move to what we are planning or what we are already doing at the international level, including at the multilateral level, and in the context of the G20 presidency, which Brazil holds during this year. So and which has a very heavy and important, strong component of sustainable development. So sustainable development is obviously top priority for Brazil, for the Brazilian government. It's a matter which, of course, is Brazil's situation in that area, and that particularly with regard to deforestation, is a subject of great attention from the international community, but it's also a very important domestic priority. President Lula, from his inauguration speech in January 2023, already set forth the objective of eliminating illegal deforestation by 2030. And that has been translated into policy ever since. Brazil launched a new plan for the protection and control of deforestation in the Amazon, which reflects that target and that objective, which was set forth by President Lula from the beginning of his term. With regard to the other pillars of sustainable development, Brazil is very much engaged in promoting economic and social development as well internally. So Brazil is a developing economy. We need to grow. Brazil has not grown as fast as we wanted over the last decade in order to promote social and economic objectives. And we need to stress and to focus on economic and social development as well as part of the overall objective of promoting sustainable development. In that regard, Brazil has, and the government has announced since last year a number of initiatives. One of them is the plan for ecological transformation. So it combines the need for economic growth, for promoting the recovery of our industrial infrastructure with social and environmental objectives. In the area of energy, Brazil is probably the area where we are most advanced. The energy transition. It's, I think, a well-known fact that Brazil's electricity matrix is composed, or 92% of Brazil's electricity generated by renewable sources. 50% of Brazil's energy matrix overall is composed also of renewable sources. And in agriculture, we have promoted over the years a number of policies to reduce emissions, to promote decarbonization through productivity enhancements, through technological development in agriculture, and through also specific measures, for example, to recover pasture lands and so on and so forth, or other agricultural technology and production techniques which have contributed to engaging agriculture in this effort to promote sustainable development, and at the same time increasing productivity and production, and remaining an important exporter of agricultural products. So trade is very important for us to achieve these objectives of promoting economic, social, and environmental development. Trade is a source of income, and income is essential for our farmers, for our entrepreneurs, for our businesses to promote and to engage in promoting environmental objectives. So these objectives are intertwined; they are not isolated from each other. And Brazilian policies, I think, try to reflect that. And briefly, at the international level, I refer to Brazil's presidency of the G20, and the climate change and sustainable development are one of the main pillars of our platform for the presidency in 2024 of the G20. So our focus here is on enhancing the finance. 2 minutes, okay, I will speed up. To enhance the mechanism for financing for sustainable development. So means of implementation is crucial if we are to achieve climate change or mitigating climate change, and also reaching adaptation objectives. Brazil has launched a task force for global mobilization to combat climate change in the context of the G20 presidency as well. There are objectives related to the energy transition, which I referred to, given the Brazilian example, but we would like to discuss this issue with our partners as well in the G20 and at the multilateral level as well, and include the issue of sustainable fuels in that discussion. And social inclusion is very much part of the promotion of the sustainable development objectives in the context of the G20. Other international initiatives which Brazil has taken in the last 2 years is the decision by President Lula to host COP30 in the Amazon, Belém, in 2025. Brazil is also cooperating with the United Arab Emirates and Azerbaijan, which are the last president of COP28, and the chair of next COP29 in Azerbaijan and Brazil. So we are cooperating in order to promote the objective of limiting temperature rises to 1.5, so-called mission 1.5. So Brazil is very much engaged in that. Speaking, I think I should speak now about Brazil view a little bit, and I think we can develop some ideas further in the discussion. We have many areas of common interest and with the EU in the area of sustainable development. We cooperate and we have a fruitful dialogue with the EU on sustainability, on environmental issues. But of course, we also have our differences. So if I could summarize, I think we share most of the objectives in terms of climate change, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of deforestation. Sometimes we differ on how to get to these objectives. The autonomous measures which the EU has put in place in the last few years, and there have been many measures taken and put into effect recently, and that is one problem. The amount of new regulation that's being implemented, that needs to be implemented, that will mean, of course, increased costs and also a challenge in terms of substantive implementation, because we don't necessarily agree with the approach that the EU has taken towards these issues. But yes, this is one area of concern. We as partners, we have conversations with the EU about these issues as well. We, at the same time, question where in the appropriate fora, the approach that has been taken with the EU. We have been trying to convey to the EU our concerns, in particular, and probably the most immediate and urgent concern is the EUDR, the deforestation regulation, but we have concerns about the other regulations that have been adopted as well, like CBAM and the due diligence regulation, and also the juxtaposition of so many new rules that are being adopted by the EU and which have effects on third parties. We are concerned, just to conclude. So it's the regulations which concern us, and also the direction, and call it maybe the direction of travel. The idea that these regulations might be expanded in the future towards new products, new biomes, and that the EU, as it develops implementation, will adopt measures which are increasingly trade restrictive. But we hope that the EU itself, as it implements and as it reflects on the results of its legislations, will also take steps to mitigate and to improve these legislations, in the sense of not placing unnecessary restrictions on trade, which, as I said, in our view, has a positive relationship with sustainable development.
Yeah.
In general, we think trade is not detrimental to sustainable development objectives. It avoids overproduction. It promotes exposure of businesses and of exporters to new technologies, which might be beneficial to sustainable development. It raises income, particularly in developing countries, and as incomes raise, we think that more sustainable practice tend to be adopted by businesses and farmers and economic agents.
Okay,
So yes, I'll stop here.
thank you very much. I'm very sorry.
I'm
but,
happy to continue later.
you will have the second opportunity to
Yeah.
react. Thank you very much. Matilde, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to bring our views also in this discussion, very important discussion. So, I wanted to start saying that the EU and many of our trade partners have taken joint commitments, not only on climate, but also on biodiversity now. And we are part of all the discussion that are going on plastic reduction and so on and so forth. So therefore, all our trade agreements should be in line with those multilateral environmental agreements. And this means that our trade agreement should be assessed according to two main questions. First, does this particular trade agreement contradict or restrict environmental policies? And second, is it contributing to the development of sustainable policies and production and consumption patterns? And I would like to say that the do not harm principle enshrined in the EU Green Deal invite us to start with the first question, which is too often neglected. So the first criteria for us to assess a trade agreement should be the sectoral coverage of the agreement. And well, for instance, to look at the EU-Mercosur trade agreement that has been agreed in 2019, just after, we can see that as most of the other trade agreements negotiated by the EU, it's aiming to promote goods and services exchanged in almost all sectors. And we believe that if we want to align this agreement with our international environmental commitment, there should be much more selective. So if we promote trade in cars and cars parts, we should develop criteria for vehicle sizes, for energy efficiency or type of engine. If we look at chemical industry, which is the most energy intensive industry, maybe it shouldn't be at the heart of this trade agreement. And export of products that have been banned from the EU market, such as dangerous pesticides or single-use plastics should not be promoted. On the contrary, they should be, we should include plans to phase out those toxic exports. So the first slide was about the exports from the EU of banned pesticides. You can show the map, no?
Right.
Well, it was just to show that we are a massive exporter of banned pesticides with or without trade agreements. And for instance, Brazil is already the second largest importer of banned pesticides manufactured in the EU, and even the largest importer of EU banned neonicotinoids. And nearly 30% of active substance of pesticides authorized in Brazil are not included in the EU due to harmful effect on health and the environment. So this is the map. Thank you.
Sorry for that.
So we export a lot to United States, to Brazil, to Japan, to Canada, to Ukraine, Australia, South Africa, and many other countries. And then you have a slide on the exports to Brazil. Because 86% of these export of banned pesticides are going to low and middle income countries. So this is something that we think should be stopped. And as a boomerang effect, the EU is already importing a lot of food grown using those substances, leading to exposure of EU consumer residues of imported goods. So this is the slide 3, the next one. So these are the example of the samples that were found. I took the example of Brazil, but Brazil is only the 21st in the rank of the residues found of banned pesticides in EU imports. So there are many other examples, of course. And after committing to ban the export of those forbidden pesticides in 2020, the EU has been backtracking under the pressure of the pesticide industry. And as I said, instead of lowering tariffs on such exports, you can go to the next one, free trade agreement should include plans to phase out those toxic exports. So these were examples. Then in addition, trade preferences should be made conditional on effective compliance with sustainability criteria for all the most sensitive products from a climate and biodiversity protection point of view. This was a recommendation of the 2009 Sustainability Impact Assessment for the EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement that was unfortunately completely disregarded by the European Commission. And the justification given at that time was that it was not a matter that should be dealt with in a free trade agreement, but only at domestic level. But during the last few years, we've seen that the issue of processes and production methods of traded goods has become more and more discussed within the EU, and the answer doesn't seem acceptable anymore. Well, I just had a picture of the recent farmers' protest, but in many EU member states, regulatory divergences were one of the main issues raised by farmers during those protests. And the last point I wanted to raise was about trade provision that restrict climate and biodiversity policies, and that should be removed. So among them, the rules and mechanisms that assess environmental policies from the perspective of trade restrictiveness should be removed, including in the regulatory preparation program and dialogue processes. And the very last point I wanted to mention in this first round of discussion is about investment protection. And investor-state disputes settlement. This is not an issue included in the EU-Mercosur trade deal, but investment chapters had been added in the modernist trade deal with Chile and Mexico, for instance. And the extensive rights offered to foreign investors, including in the fossil fuel sector, through BIT or investment chapter and trade agreements, are not in line with the commitment that we have taken in the Paris Agreement. So at international level, there's growing recognition of the incompatibility of the investment protection regime with international environmental and climate commitment. The IPCC mentioned it in its 2022 report. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment also called on states to unilaterally or jointly terminate international investment treaty that contain an ISDS. in its 2023 reports. And the OECD has launched a dialogue aimed at revising its investment protection policies in light of the Paris agreements, and in particular, its Article 2.1.c requiring financial flows to be aligned with climate objectives.
Okay.
No, just to say that this is something where we've seen a lot of change at international level. Many Latin American countries have taken different approach on this issue. Brazil has never signed a BIT with the ISDS, and we really think that this is something that should be discussed in the Trade and Climate Minister Coalition and at G20 in the coming years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matilde. Then we go to our last speaker, Andrea.
Thank you very much. I'll also share my slides. Can you see it? Can you see my slides on the screen?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Well, I'm sharing it.
Online there.
Perhaps.
Leo can see them here online.
Yeah, I can see it.
They online.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, can you see it or not?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, please.
Can you see the slides?
Yes, Andrea, we can see the slides.
Okay, good. So, well, thank you very much again. I think my presentation will contextualize a bit also the agenda of trade and sustainable development into a broader agenda of cooperation about climate change. And I'll focus on ULAC relations, of course. And I start just with a very brief, because I don't have much time, but I published on that a very brief a mapping of how climate change has been introduced in Latin American regionalism, and then I focus on ULAC relations and bring some points of contention in the agenda and governance of this topic. So here I'll be really brief. I'm glad to come back to this in the Q&A later, but this mapping basically summarizes some of the measures, norms, but also measures and projects being included at the regional level, because I'm not looking at individual countries, but the regional level in Latin America, since that has been also a platform for cooperation in other topics. And to summarize here, basically, I mean, and here I agree plainly with the previous presentation by Johan, there hasn't been much at the regional level in terms of also implementation and effective policies. If we talk about Mercosur, for instance, that's normally one of the main forum by regional cooperation. It hasn't really implemented much. It's basically declaratory norms. PROSUR had started including more directly, but it doesn't include all Latin American countries anyway. And CELAC, which is the country, the organization or platform that includes all member states, they refer a lot to the SDGs, and there's no real agenda at the regional level. So that's why I'm also investigating some other multilateral platforms in Latin America, which have been including commitments related to climate change. One of them is the Amazon Cooperation Treaty, which is an old treaty, a bit forgotten. However, after Lula's election in Brazil, and after, of course, the terrible government of Bolsonaro in terms of, among others, climate change, there has been a lot of pressure for this government to show some change into the policy. And one of them was to try to reactivate the Amazon Treaty Cooperation. There was a summit already in 2023. There is a Belém Declaration that came out of it. It was held in Belém, the same city that will host the COP in 2025. So there is serious engagement also with the transregional civil society, the Diálogos Amazônicos. Of course, this treaty focuses in the biome of the Amazon, not other. However, it has been a quite interesting space to look at how Latin American countries belonging to the treaty, of course, they are not all, they are trying to incorporate in the agenda some of these concerns, among others, the deforestation that has been talked a lot about, but also with the social point of view and human rights as well, including the concerns of indigenous peoples and local communities. It has also discussed how these measures, the measures that were agreed on the declaration, will be implemented, and there has been engagement with the development banks, the Brazilian Development Bank and the and the Inter-American Development Bank. So there's some sign of a serious commitment with trying to deal with their frustration and mining, for instance, those topics that have been discussed with the EU. Another example about how the Latin American countries have been trying to take seriously this agenda outside, again, the trade key is the Escazú Agreement, which has also an old agreement. It was in force, however, only to take into force only in 2021. Brazil didn't ratify yet this agreement. There is a lot of pressure on the current government of Lula as well to ratify. Apparently, there's a lot of opposition, of course, in the Congress. The government doesn't control the Congress. That's also healthy that the executive and the Congress are separate powers. However, for that agenda, it has been a problem because of the very powerful agribusiness lobby, despite the change of executive. And what I can say about this Escazú Agreement also that takes a human rights approach. So again, it's a serious agenda to handle environment and climate change, however, not necessarily to trade. And I think this is important because when we move to the bilateral agenda with the EU and all these instruments that are being included through the trade agreements, sometimes we lose sight about all the efforts that are being done in other with other mechanisms, other also perspectives. Like I said, the human rights perspective, including the social communities at the local level. With the EU, we know that the EU-CELAC partnership is the one that embraces all countries, as such as CELAC for the regionalism in Latin America. There is references to climate change. However, this is a political dialogue forum and with no real commitments, not even in terms also of political of development cooperation. So it is important to share and to try to share those values and the interest to put climate change top in the agenda. But it's not really the place where this can really be very active. Rather, as I mentioned, those two other platforms, the Escazú and the Amazon Treaty, they do have observers from the EU. They have, in the case of France, for instance, in the Amazon, it is an observer also to the treaty. So meetings and summits. So there is also possibility to foster the political dialogue there. And I hear for the sake of an example, because there are a lot of these bilateral treaties with the sub-region organizations, they were already mentioned, just as an example that with Mercosur, as also discussed from the previous presenters, the agreement was signed, but it's not ratified, and climate change, well, environmental conditions was a key element. At that time, in 2019, we had Bolsonaro in the government with this terrible policy, among others, in climate change. So protest against the agreement was particularly strong also in terms of either legitimation his government, but also his own policies on climate change. Therefore, all the items that were included, and as I understand also this approach to climate change that was included in other EU treaties with other countries as well and regions, they were on the side of the civil society very welcome. Of course, if you have a government that's destroying the national regulation of for instance, even in the case of forests, to put the finger on the UDR that we are discussing, of course, this was most than welcome as at least a sign or a political support or a political opposition to this government's foreign policy. However, the way that this agreement has been negotiated since 2016 was pretty much criticized. It was not transparent. I mean, of course, civil society, to the extent that there was some access to what was being negotiated, was making its own positions. But the whole process had been, since Temer's government, very much closed. And the objective to conclude the agreement was put forward in terms of sometimes the substantial commitments. And there was, therefore, a lot of opposition. There are some works, made by the external consultancies about the gains of this agreement, and they're very low. Therefore, I mean, there was also not a big support on the agreement by civil society or also even economic business. However, this remains, and I'll and finish with this last slide. This remains one of the spaces where in the relations with Latin America, all these sub-regional agreements. It was mentioned some bilateral, of course, such as with Chile. In the case of Brazil, that it is still, and I'll put that, maybe we can just talk about it in the Q&A. I mean, of course, Mercosur has been under fire by many governments, including Bolsonaro. That's not the position of the actual government, but the literature shows there is a cross-government lack of support to this agreement, also on the domestic, even not only agribusiness, but industrial sectors. So it's only one question if in the case of Brazil, that will be the bi-regional, but not the bilateral agreement, the most fruitful. Anyway, there is definitely a window of opportunity in terms of Latin America, but also the government with this new government. It was already mentioned. I think the effort is real. No, there are a lot of people engaged in this government who come also from civil society and activists, climate change, that have been fighting for environmental and climate change, such as Minister Marina da Silva, certainly, and for many times. However, this government also, as I mentioned, has huge lobbies of agribusiness, and that's the case of other Latin American countries as well, as most are exporters of commodities. I mentioned here the case of pesticide has been very much discussed. I'm finishing, sorry.
Thank you.
So just to really conclude, some of the points of contentions, which are, first of all, definitely strategies of industrialization. Even if it's green industrialization, it means to facing those lobbies in those governments, and that shouldn't be taken as a lack of effort of the governments. However, how to do that? Biomas, the Amazon is a center of attention, but other biomas in Latin America are also suffering, and in terms of also the extraction of lithium, for instance, that has been reported a lot of the negative effects, and that's one of the products that are favored in the trade agreements. In terms of responsibilities, these trade agreements, they emphasize corporate responsibilities. However, Latin American and Global South countries tend to emphasize responsibility of countries in terms of the common border efficiencies principle, responsibilities principle. Resources, definitely regional development banks. As I said, in Latin America, we are mobilizing the existing regional development banks. However, that's the question about how the EU will also mobilize, or how the EU Gateway, for instance, can favor those. And finally, of course, the mechanisms that was already mentioned, the UDR, and I stop here because I pretty much agree with the positions that were already presented, that on one hand, there is a lot of support for any mechanisms that contribute to the fight against climate change. However, there is a certain concern that this will be, in the end, the weight of this will be on small producers, exactly the ones that should be being protected and not hold the costs. I stop here, I'm sorry. I'm, of course, look forward for the discussions soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. So then we will have a second round just for you to react vis-a-vis the presentation of your colleagues. We don't have too much time, so I will give you 3 minutes per presenter.
Thanks a lot, and many thanks for the interesting interventions indeed. I think maybe now looking a bit forward and also trying to react to the comments made. I think in the next mandate of the Commission, and this is of course something we are now preparing inside and very much thinking about it, the way the debate between trade and sustainability will evolve, I think it will continue to be very central. And it will evolve in the direction of a continuous narrowing of the gaps, I would say. Narrowing of the gaps between trade and environment. We talked about the trade and environment nexus. And this can be done, for example, through increasing the mainstreaming of sustainability in trade policy and trade agreements. I said New Zealand is a gold standard. New Zealand includes, for example, a list of environmental goods and services on which trade should be further facilitated. This is a positive way of mainstreaming sustainability in trade. I think very clearly also we are looking at addressing sustainability in trade by going beyond the usual trade tools, going beyond the tariffs, and looking at how sustainable and how sustainably produced are the goods we import. And this is also a trend that is here to stay. Now, so the trade and environment nexus, narrowing that gap. Secondly, also narrowing the gap between our internal policies and their external impact. I think this is something that must be further deepened going forward, and notably integrating the external impact very early on in the policy design of this regulatory tools. And when I say integrating the external impact, integrating as well the input and the reactions and the dialogues we have with our partners, which must be, I would say, even further strengthened. And also making sure that the EU's policies and actions are also very much integrated with our own member states and their external positioning. So this is to reply a little bit on your synergies question and to see how we can narrow the gap between these different elements. Now, of course, the obstacles.
1 minute to conclude, please.
Okay, very clearly, then the obstacles that we have to deal with will remain in terms of ensuring the trade-offs between the long-term environmental benefits and the short-term costs. This is something that afflicts politicians everywhere, and this has been a very difficult element in our discussions. We need to see how we can tip the balance through incentives, through a more positive discussion with our partners to tip that balance there. And I would just like to leave here as an example what we have been doing in West Africa and the cocoa producers. I know it's not the geographical scope of today, but this has been for us a gold standard in terms of involving smallholders, which was one of the points you were making, by associating fighting against deforestation with ensuring a proper living income for farmers. And that's I conclude there. The obstacles are there, but we also need to see the opportunities. If we learn how to put a premium on sustainability, through trade and including through trade, but also through cooperation and other means, the debate will move on from whether we should do this to how we should do this. And I think that is the EU's responsibility internationally to bring others along. I'll stop here, sorry.
Thank you very much, Dora. Please.
Okay, I'll be short. Indeed, I mean, my experience, having worked at ECLAC for 18 years and heading the Trade and Sustainability Unit, I very much have become aware that the climate community and the trade community are very separate. Probably you noticed it in the EU as well, but in Latin America, it's like those communities hardly meet. So I think there's an enormous job to be done of bringing these communities together and in different occasions. And I think in particular the trade agreements is a very good mechanisms, and the partners are actually meeting, and I think we have all the domestic policies that the EU that you are promoting. I think could be really a vehicle, those committees and those agreements to see how we can bridge that gap between reality right now and what is needed in the future without leaving aside all, in particular the small producers. Now, I think indeed the agreement that promoted by New Zealand, Costa Rica, and other countries is really, I think, an excellent way forward. And I would also, like Andrea said, the example of the Escazú agreement, which actually is being promoted by ECLAC, is also, I think, a very good model of how like-minded countries, and maybe with the support of Euroclima, I mean, in the EU, could be a very good vehicle to work with like-minded countries and set an example, and also to look what is going on the ground and see how national initiatives like Elias was mentioning, how they can connect to European initiatives.
Thank you very much. Elias, please, from you.
Thank you, and I apologize for having surpassed my time.
No problem.
by a lot, perhaps. Well, I'd like to focus on just a few points. Thank my colleagues again here in the panel for the discussion and for very interesting points that they raised. For us, I think what is essential is that whatever approach is taken to address sustainable development issues, in particular when they affect trade, that they are collaborative, that they are cooperative. So it was mentioned here that the important step in the future might be to reflect on how these sustainable development objectives might be achieved. And we think that for that to be acceptable to all partners which are interested in promoting a sustainable development agenda, cooperation and negotiation is essential. We are not going to agree on the how if solely by discussing SN or TSD issues on the basis of one framework which is proposed by one particular player like the EU, or by discussing implementation of domestic legislation of one partner. So negotiation and cooperation will be essential, and a negotiation and cooperation in which the terms of this cooperation, of this understanding, are also subject to discussion. So we can't have this discussion on the how based on a one size fits all approach. So this is I think the message that I would like to leave. I think there were some very interesting things that were mentioned here. I think that about the BAT with ISDS, actually, I don't know a lot about this, but Brazil has had issues with the BIT model, as you know. So we haven't engaged in BIT negotiations with any partner. So and we have a model we have chosen to negotiate actually cooperation facilitation agreements in the area of investment, which is a somewhat different model. I think that I wanted to mention at the regional or bi-regional level, actually, Mercosur, you just briefly, that the agreement and the TSD chapter in particular, which was concluded in 2019, was quite advanced. It contains a number of important commitments on both sides. Mercosur, in the spirit of compromise, accepted many provisions there, which went at the time beyond maybe what we would consider ideal in terms of TSD chapter. So it was it is still a quite advanced framework. So the EU-Mercosur agreement tries to address that issue of trade and sustainable development. We are now engaged in the discussion of an additional instrument with the EU, in which the purpose of Mercosur is to also make sure that our views are taken into account. So we received a proposal from the EU. We presented a counter proposal in which we presented our views and with the purpose of rebalancing the discussion within the agreement and taking into account what has taken place, particularly in the EU since 2019, including the autonomous measures. So we think that the autonomous measures change the picture and potentially could alter the terms of the concessions that were agreed in 2019. So we needed to address that in a new negotiating process with the EU. And we are still in the process of doing that. So the EU-Mercosur agreement has, or negotiation is also dealing with the issue of trade and sustainable development. We need balance, and Mercosur needs to have an adequate policy space to undertake policies to promote development and industrial and the so-called reindustrialization of Brazil, which is basically to promote the recovery of Brazil's industrial infrastructure, which has been an important component of our economy. I mean, for the last probably 70 years since the post-war. So that's our, I think, our perspective on this.
Thank you very much, Matilde.
Yeah, maybe just to highlight 2 points. First, on the consistency of the EU approach. This is why I've been insisting on export bans for toxic exports, and also on the lack of coherence between the EU approach during the modernization of the Energy Charter Treaty, in which the EU aims to end the protection of investment in fossil fuel, and the fact that this is not what we are doing with other countries, such as like Chile or Mexico. So here, if we really want to show consistency and to convince our trade partners that what we are looking for is more the integration of sustainability criteria in our trade agreements and investment agreements, we really need to try to be very clear on these double standards or approach. And also to say that maybe we should also focus more on multilateral cooperation, for instance, on pesticides, because I've been mentioning this topic a lot. There is a fora at an international level to discuss on standards on pesticide, which is the Codex, which is a joint body from the FAO and the WTO. But the environment is not really part of its mandate. So far, it's more focusing on health. And now that we have the biodiversity framework from Montreal, we should, of course, extend the mandate of this fora to the protection of biodiversity and to the environment too. And it would be very fruitful to have those discussions at international level, at multilateral level. And of course, it would be always better to have stronger international standards before we had to take autonomous measure on this kind of topic.
Thank you very much, Matilde. Andrea, last reflections?
Yeah, thank you. Well, just I think as a last message, I think to reinforce the necessity to deal with this matter regionally, not only bilateral in terms of countries, because in Latin America, those biomes, they cross the border. So it doesn't help if you have a wonderful agreement with one country and all those illegal mining and illegal deforestation and illegal plantations will cross the border into another country. So given the difficulty of having agreements such as Mercosur, but perhaps other agreements more comprehensive in Latin America, I think it's very important to complement the trade policies with other multilateral agreements. Therefore, I was mentioning those two, which I think that the EU could support because it's in favor also of the objectives of the trade policy. No, I think we can think in terms of that. The objective is in the end to protect the forest and so to combine other mechanisms, not see. And then, of course, to the extent that in the trade agreements, it's better than, of course, to have a locus, by regional locus to talk, but instead of just having the imposition of unilateral measures. But again, if the cause is good, I think also in the case of Latin America, there is a very strong obsession with the intrusiveness, also sovereignty. So I think that on both sides, there are, of course, limits to that can be thought through, like how to approach to reach more this common interests that they are there. And therefore, again, just to conclude, I think it's always very important to keep this transparency. I think it was mentioned in the beginning by the Commission, but also in the case of Brazil, it varies according to governments. We cannot forget that. We live in very polarized, still, unfortunately, context politically, and this commitment to inclusion of society and transparency is important, because otherwise, when you implement those, whatever commitment is, if the society is not engaged, it will resist, it will impede, and it will politically not contribute to a stable government. So I think that, again, to finish with the positive moment, again, I think we have this window of opportunity in the case of South America hosting the COP, and a lot of efforts by some governments, definitely also, it seems, the Brazilian government to move forward with this agenda in the region. Thank you very much.